right, so welcome to another deep dive, and this time we're going to look into some pretty foundational ideas.
Yeah, some stuff that I think a lot of people are going to find really resonates even today.
Yeah, and for this one, as always, you guys sent in what you want us to dive into. And looks like this time we're going to be taking a look at the Vincent Crown podcast and their discussion on William Walker Atkinson.
Right, specifically part 2 of Law of Attraction and Thought Vibration.
Yeah, and this is, Atkinson, a cornerstone of the New Thought movement.
Huge, yeah.
So understanding these principles, I think, gives a really good look at, the origins of a lot of these popular concepts.
Yeah.
Around mindset and reality.
Exactly.
So Atkinson wrote this back in 1906.
Wow.
So very much in a historical context linked to Hermeticism and the Kybalion.
Right.
So for those interested in the roots of this kind of thinking, the Kybalion, which sometimes is also attributed to Atkinson, lays out 7 Hermetic principles that really kind of influenced this era.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a lineage with deep roots.
For sure.
And our goal with this deep dive, based on, your request, is to really unpack Atkinson's core arguments about the power of the mind.
Yeah.
And how thought vibration shapes what we experience.
Right.
And we're specifically going to be looking at it through the lens of how the Vincent Crown podcast host interprets and elaborates on these ideas.
Absolutely, yeah.
Really trying to make these potentially abstract concepts a little bit more clear and applicable.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so let's dive right into the first concept.
Okay.
Atkinson's idea that we possess a single mind,
Okay.
but many different mental faculties.
Okay.
Now, this isn't about having multiple personalities or anything like that. It's
Right.
about one core consciousness
Gotcha.
with different ways of processing and engaging with the world.
I see. Okay.
So one of the things that the Vincent Crown podcast highlights here is this distinction between actively and passively using these mental faculties.
Okay.
So active force, as he explains it, stems from our conscious thoughts in the present moment.
Okay.
So what we're intentionally thinking about right now.
Okay, so right now I'm actively thinking about what you're saying.
Exactly.
Cool.
It's like we're actively directing the beam of a mental flashlight.
Okay.
But then there's the passive side.
Right.
And the Vincent Crown podcast outlines that as having several sources. So he mentions external suggestions, the thoughts and opinions of others around us. But this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
He even talks about influences from ancestral thought patterns.
Interesting. Okay, yeah, so things that may be out of our control even.
Yeah, it's not just what our parents bought us. It could even be stuff that is kind of built into the system
Right.
genetically.
Yeah.
And the podcast host takes a very broad view of this passive force.
Okay.
And so he sees it as encompassing our deeply held opinions, the guidance that we seek and receive, and even, like we said, inherited tendencies and predispositions, including genetics.
Okay.
So it's like this existing mental atmosphere in which our active thoughts then operate.
Interesting.
So we have these active directed thoughts and this more background passive influence
Mm-hmm.
that are shaping our mental landscape.
Yeah,
So how do these then interact and develop over time?
right.
That's what we're going to look at next, which is how these initial active thoughts can become automatic.
Okay.
And this is a crucial element because the Vincent Crown podcast really emphasizes that when we actively engage in a particular thought or mental process repeatedly, it can solidify into a habit.
Okay.
So what starts as a conscious effort eventually becomes an automatic response,
Right.
requiring less and less deliberate intention.
So it's like practicing something over and over again. You kind of get good at it and you don't even have to think about it.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the podcast connects this directly to our emotions and feelings,
Okay.
explaining that these can be really deeply rooted in our past experiences, our upbringing and education, and even, like we said, our inherent genetic makeup.
Okay, so our feelings are coming from those 3 sources primarily.
Yeah, they kind of build up this momentum.
Okay.
And can become our go-to emotional and mental setting.
Default setting.
Yeah.
I like that.
So to illustrate this, the Vincent Crown podcast introduces Joe Dispenza's framework.
Okay.
And Dispenza talks about how moods can last for hours or days.
Okay.
Temperaments tend to persist over weeks.
Right.
And personality traits can become ingrained over years.
Okay.
So this progression really highlights how these habitual thought patterns can deepen and become integral to our sense of self.
Okay, so like you were saying earlier, it's like a ripple in a pond that slowly becomes this wave,
Exactly.
and then eventually could even change the entire pond.
Exactly. And I think the important thing that the podcast host underscores here is that the aim isn't to feel trapped by these negative habits,
Yeah,
but to consciously begin to shift them towards more positive ones.
right.
And it starts with becoming aware of our emotions
Okay.
and the thoughts that drive them.
Yeah, because we might not be conscious of what's leading to those feelings.
Exactly.
Interesting. Okay.
So let's look at how our active thoughts can actually start to influence these more passive ingrained vibrations.
Okay.
And this is where the core of the law of attraction, as Atkinson presents it, really comes into focus.
Right.
So Atkinson posits that when we actively generate a thought, it emits a certain vibration.
Okay.
And the Vincent Crown podcast clarifies that these vibrations have the power to shape our subsequent passive thought patterns.
Okay.
It's like these signals that we're actively sending out
Right.
tend to influence the kind of signals that we then passively receive
Right.
and resonate with internally.
Interesting. So it's almost like, I'm trying to think of like a metaphor for that. So it's like if you put out a certain frequency, then you're going to receive that same frequency back.
Yeah, and I think the podcast host puts it simply as what we emit mentally, so our thoughts tends to be reflected back to us in our internal experience.
Okay.
But even more powerfully, he points out that actively choosing our thoughts can also help to neutralize negative, unwanted thought patterns.
Okay, so we can push back on that.
Yeah.
With the thoughts we're choosing.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he even connects this to the idea of using mantras,
Oh, okay.
which are those consciously chosen positive affirmations as a way to actively counteract negative mental loops.
Right, right. I've heard of that.
Yeah, so it's not just that we're passively subjected to these mental vibrations.
Right.
We have the agency to actually actively shape them.
So we have control
Yeah.
to a degree.
Yes.
Okay, cool.
So now the question is, what happens once a thought impulse is initiated? Does it just dissipate quickly?
Yeah, good question.
And according to Atkinson, no.
Okay.
The Vincent Crown podcast explains that once a thought impulse is set in motion, it continues to vibrate passively until we consciously step in to redirect it, or until its energy naturally diminishes over time.
Right, so it's going to stay there unless we do something about it.
Exactly. These mental impulses have a kind of inertia,
Right.
a tendency to keep going.
Okay.
And the podcast host provides a really clear analogy here. He compares negative thoughts, when repeated, to moving from our conscious awareness down into our subconscious,
Okay.
becoming deeply ingrained like automatic bodily functions like breathing, our heartbeat.
Oh, okay.
We don't have to consciously tell ourselves to do these things, they just happen in the background.
Interesting, yeah.
And the podcast host emphasizes that this principle applies to both positive and negative thoughts.
Okay.
But the more a negative thought is repeated and given attention, the stronger its hold on our mental landscape becomes.
Yeah, it's like strengthening that pathway.
Exactly.
Okay.
And he gives a practical example of this. Negative self-talk, like constantly thinking something bad is going to happen today. He illustrates how this kind of persistent negative anticipation can actually create a mental environment where negative events are more likely to be noticed and felt, almost creating a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right, right. If you're expecting something bad to happen, you're going to be looking for it.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Okay, so let's shift our focus a little bit.
Okay.
And consider our natural human inclinations.
Okay.
So Atkinson touches on this idea that we have an inherent tendency to gravitate towards what satisfies our desires.
Okay.
And the Vincent Crown podcast host actually recalls a Latin proverb that his teacher used: the goat always returns to the mountain.
Oh, interesting.
It's this idea of this natural pull,
Mhm.
an inherent inclination to go back to what feels familiar
Yeah.
or satisfying, almost on an instinctual level.
Right.
And he connects this to the idea of mental appetite.
Mental appetites. Okay.
These are passive mental impulses that originate from that initial underlying desire, and they gain strength through evolutionary development.
Right. So it's not just our desires, but it's like this evolutionary thing built in.
Yeah, it's almost like they've been refined and amplified over vast stretches of time.
Interesting.
So he gives some really relatable examples: choosing a faster car over a more practical one, or consistently opting for foods that we find enjoyable. It's that immediate draw towards pleasure or gratification.
Right, right.
But he also extends this to something more subtle: the tendency to project past painful experiences onto current situations and even onto other people.
Okay.
It's like we can develop an appetite for certain emotional patterns,
Yeah.
even if they aren't ultimately beneficial.
Right. So it's like even our negative patterns, we can return to them because they're familiar.
Exactly.
Interesting.
So Atkinson also observes that much of our reasoning isn't truly evolved, conscious thinking.
Okay.
It operates more as a form of passive intellection.
Okay. So we're not really thinking about it.
Yeah, it's kind of happening in the background. So the podcast host interprets this to mean that often our minds are running on a kind of autopilot.
Okay.
We're thinking automatically,
Right.
reacting based on ingrained patterns without necessarily being fully aware of the underlying processes.
Right.
And yet we often strongly identify with these automatic thought patterns,
Mm-hmm.
believing that they represent our true selves.
Right.
And what's particularly interesting is that the podcast host points out that these learned mindsets can actually provide us with a sense of identity and security.
Okay.
We can become attached to them, reinforce them, sometimes even deriving a strange sense of validation or comfort from negative traits or habitual reactions.
That is interesting.
It's like, this is just who I am.
Right.
But it might not be serving us very well.
Right.
And he provides some really vivid examples of this, reacting with frustration or anger to minor inconveniences, the coffee shop being out of our favorite drink, someone else using our preferred workspace, a brief delay in an elevator.
Yeah. Yeah.
These are those automatic reactive patterns that we often just accept as our default way of responding.
Right. Right.
And importantly, the podcast echoes Atkinson's observation that many people seem to prefer to let external sources or established norms dictate their thinking.
Okay.
This leads to a less critical acceptance of outside influences and past conditioning.
Right.
And it can feel easier to go along with the familiar than to actively question and choose our own thoughts.
Right. Because it takes more effort to actually question things.
Exactly.
And to come up with your own conclusion.
But the really empowering message here, which both Atkinson and the Vincent Crown podcast emphasize, is that we have an inherent ability to break free from being solely driven by these negative influences or automatic patterns.
Okay.
We possess volitional power, our willpower, to consciously choose different thoughts and cultivate more constructive reactions.
Okay, so willpower comes into play.
Yes.
All right. And this brings us directly to the crucial role of willpower and mental training.
So Atkinson suggests that we can actually enhance our mind's responsiveness to our own willpower through consistent and focused practice.
Okay, so it's like a muscle.
Exactly.
You have to work it out.
Yeah, and the podcast clarifies that while willpower itself is a potent force, our minds need to be trained to effectively receive and act upon its directives,
Okay.
particularly when it comes to implementing our own positive intentions and breaking free from established habits.
So willpower alone isn't enough.
Right, it's like having a powerful engine but needing to learn how to skillfully steer it.
I like that, yeah.
And the podcast host highlights the value of resources like Dispenza's work and Atkinson's own writings in this training process.
Mm-hmm.
They offer frameworks and techniques to help us become more aware of our ingrained thought patterns and consciously begin to shift them in desired directions.
Okay.
And that essential first step, as the podcast emphasizes, is courageous self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
We have to be willing to honestly examine our existing thought patterns, even the uncomfortable ones, and commit to the effort required to modify them.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not always easy to confront these aspects of ourselves.
Right.
Now, Atkinson also refers to the flow of willpower through what he terms the spiritual wiring.
Okay.
So how does the podcast interpret this concept in a more of a contemporary understanding?
Yeah, what does that even mean?
Yeah, and the podcast offers a really interesting interpretation, connecting the spiritual wiring to the biochemical processes within our bodies.
Okay.
The interplay of hormones, neuropeptides, and neurotransmitters flowing along the spine and the solar plexus.
Okay.
This is, drawing on the kind of physiological understanding that figures like Dispenza have really explored.
Right.
So it's less about purely ethereal connection and more about the physical and chemical pathways through which our intentions and mental energy can manifest within our biological system.
That's really interesting.
So it provides a really grounded and relatable way to understand what Atkinson might have been pointing towards within the scientific understanding of his time.
Right. Yeah, I like that.
So as we bring this deep dive to a close, we've explored Atkinson's profound ideas on the mind and the power of thought vibration.
Yep.
As thoughtfully examined by the Vincent Crown podcast.
Mm-hmm.
We've looked at the dynamic between our active and passive thoughts,
Right?
the mechanics of how habits are formed through repetition,
Yeah.
the significant influence of our conscious thoughts,
Right.
the persistent nature of our mental patterns, our inherent human tendencies,
Yeah.
the prevalence of automatic thinking,
Yeah.
and the remarkable potential we all possess for cultivating and directing our willpower.
Right. Right.
And the podcast host leaves us with the powerful reminder that the law of attraction is constantly operating in our lives, whether we are consciously aware of it or not.
Yeah.
But the truly empowering message is that we absolutely have the capacity to consciously shape our habits and ultimately our experience of reality through focused awareness, consistent effort, and clear intention.
That's good.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you to really chew on this week.
All right.
Consider just one automatic thought pattern that really resonated with you during our discussion today.
Okay.
Perhaps a recurring worry or a habitual reaction.
Mm-hmm.
And ask yourself, what single, small, conscious, active thought could you intentionally introduce as a counterpoint, as a way to gently begin to shift its passive influence?
Okay.
It's a starting point, a tiny seed of intentional change.
I like that.
And we really encourage you to explore that this week.
Awesome.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time.
All right, see ya.